Good afternoon, folks. We're going to get started with today's program. I'm Sarah Watson. I'm the director of the Murphy Institute here at CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, and thank you all so much for joining us today for the program Lessons from 100 Years of Black Labor Activism, Fighting Racial Authoritarianism, and Building Cross-Movement Solidarity. A big welcome to our program speakers, Cedric DeLeon, Bill Fletcher Jr., Tamara Lee, and today's moderator, Cameron Black. Before I introduce Cameron and turn the program over to him, I want to thank the public engagement team, IT, communications, and facilities teams for all their work in making today's program possible. I also want to share some info about a few upcoming programs we have at the Murphy Institute. On Thursday, November 13th at 1 p.m., we'll have a Zoom-only program, The New Mayor of New York City, a post-election debrief, a CityWorks Media Roundtable moderated by Laura Flanders, and we'll be live streaming that live from CUNY TV studios. And next month on December 9th at 6:30 p.m., I hope you'll join us either in person or on Zoom for the 2005 NYC Transit Workers' Strike, Reflections on the 20th Anniversary, a conversation with Roger Toussaint, former president of TWU Local 100. And there's a flyer at the check-in desk that has info on both of these programs. A couple notes about today's program. We have a limited number of copies of Cedric's new book, Freedom Train, and that's available for SLU students that are here today. Please see a member of the public engagement team to receive a copy if you haven't yet. For non-SLU students, there is a flyer on the check-in table that has a QR code that will offer a 30% discount on Cedric's book. At the close of today's event, Cedric will sign copies of the book, and Bill Fletcher Jr. will have copies of his books available for purchase and also be signing copies. Following the conversation portion of today's event, we'll have an opportunity for audience Q&A. So there's two different ways you can register questions. We have half sheets of paper that'll be coming around from members in the public engagement team. You can write your questions. We'll also have two roving mics, and we'll do the first kind of round of roving mic live questions for SLU students first, then open to all folks. Let's see. Okay. So it is now my pleasure to welcome and introduce Professor Cameron Black. Cameron is an assistant professor of labor studies at CUNY SLU, and he is a historian of the United States history, student-athlete protest in the 1960s, the history of capitalism, and labor and culture history. He studies at the intersections of race, class, and labor, and how we think about who qualifies as labor and what processes go into those distinctions. Cameron's full bio, as well as all of the other speakers' bios, are included on a printout that's also available at the check-in desk. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming Cameron and our speakers for today. Thank you all so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope we are all doing well on a cool yet gorgeous Friday afternoon. I would like to thank each and every one of you for being here with us today. I imagine this is going to be, I think, an exceptionally fruitful but extremely fun time. So I would like to start off our program thinking at least somewhat broadly about our title, right? Lessons from 100 Years of Black Labor Activism and the Formation of Racial Authoritarianism. As I think all of us here are aware, we broadly struggle against authoritarian movements domestically and abroad. But this is, of course, not uniquely situated to our present moment. Black labor organizers historically have pushed back forcefully, legally and extra-legally against authoritarian movements in the United States directed against specifically their own labor activism. And at least starting off this program for our speakers here today, I would like to start off a question centered around Black political activity and Black labor activity. Black activists naturally engaged in politics, and their politics, I think, had a unique impact on the United States, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. I would love to hear from our speakers more about these intersections and how Black activists have shaped the labor movement more broadly, and maybe we can start from there.
Thanks, Cameron, and thanks, Bill and Tammy, for engaging in this conversation with me. I want to thank Michael, Sarah, and Nadia for doing all the logistical work and all the workers who made this event possible. And I want to shout out friends who showed up to this event. Ruth, Orly, Amy, and Sam, thank you so much for being here, and to all of you for being here. So what I want to say two things about the interconnection between Black politics and Black labor activism over the past 100 years. The first thing is that hardly anybody writes about Black labor activists over the last 100 years, right? When we think about, for example, the struggle for interracial labor solidarity, most of the stories that we tell each other in labor spaces, in labor books, is that interracial solidarity is the invention primarily, the political project primarily of white communists and white progressive CIO organizers and leaders, okay? There are hardly any books at all about the role that Black workers played, right, in advancing the cause of interracial class solidarity. But in fact, if you look at the historical record, as I have in my new book, Freedom Train, what you see is actually that among white trade unionists, white union members, and white workers, folks were uneven, inconsistent in their support of this idea of class solidarity, right, among white constituencies. And that the most consistent advocate for this vision of the multiracial labor movement that we have today were Black workers and Black union activists. And so that's the first thing that I want to say, right, that Black folks really formed the vanguard of the idea of class solidarity, right, over the last 100 years. The second thing that I'll say about Black politics is that it's not a smooth road. We're not talking about, a sort of unified collective struggle of truth and beauty and everybody was together. It was messy. There was a lot of factionalism, especially between what I call the centrist faction and the left faction of Black civil society. But I also want to say that it was that interplay. It was the fight, actually, between the center and the left of Black civil society that pushed the cause of interracial solidarity forward, because it led to kind of like the invention of like new tactics, new strategies for mass mobilization and building power from below.
Mic check. Hi, everyone. I'm Tammy Lee, in case if I have never met you before. It's nice to see you. I'm going to zoom out like I often do. I'm a super macro person. And when I think about Black politics, I'd rather maybe say Black political advocacy or political participation to sort of take it out of two-party state dynamics. I do a lot of work looking at what we call intersectional organizing movements of the last, some contemporary ones like Black Lives Matter. I would put Women's March in there, some of the movements that we're doing now. But I'm basically always talking to Black workers in the South. And what I've learned to do is to give historical context to what I see them doing right now in terms of political participation in the enterprise. And I'm going to put my legal hat on for a minute as well, because we were talking a little bit before the panel started about not only the history of this country always having as a target black bodies in terms of state tyranny. And we can trace black activism or collective responses to that since before we were forcibly brought here, probably. I'm not the historian, but I could make that argument. And so in some ways, it's a question of what is the labor movement versus what is a social movement. And if you center black workers and black activists, it's always been bigger than wages, hours, and working conditions, right? It's always been about democracy, humanization, right? That journey from chattel property to whatever we have now, which was brought to us by black worker movements, right? And so in addition to that, thinking about state authoritarianism against black workers and activists, I would also argue, and maybe we'll get more into it, that the responses to moments of authoritarianism in this country have also always run through black bodies. Nobody has the constitutional amendments of due process or equal protection without the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, the Reconstruction amendments, right? So without black workers rising and bringing forth, right, the end of enslavement and the incorporation of black people into the body politic, nobody has due process or equal protection. We're starting to see when there are attacks on black workers, and we can I'll leave it to the historians to tell us what the critical junctures are, but whenever there is a backlash against black workers, it affects everybody. Right? LGBT rights are under attack because of equal protection, right? We're seeing an erosion of those rights. So I think authoritarianism runs through black bodies, but also the responses to it and those moments where we have had incremental change towards justice also runs through black activism.
My thanks for being invited, and my thanks for you all joining us today, and particularly to some friends of mine who have come here, which really honors me. So I warned Cameron about the questions because these questions could lead us to be here until about 6. I would be speaking until 5, and I'd be generous enough to give the other hour. So I want to just say 2 things. One, I want to start with this thing about black. So what's interesting about black, and this becomes very important because of current debates within the black community now that are underway in part because of a right-wing black nationalist group called ADOS, is the question of who is black and what does that mean in a U.S. context. So when we talk about black politics, we have to first start with black is those of us that are the descendants of slaves that were brought to North America. It also includes Cape Verdeans, who were the first African people to come to the United States voluntarily post-1492. It includes Caribbean people who particularly started coming after the Spanish-American War, and it includes Afro-Latinos. And so the beautiful thing about Black America is that it's constantly evolving. You can't freeze it. You can't do what ADOS says, which is that it was the so-called freedmen. That's the term that they use, which was the original term after we got out of slavery, and just say, that's Black America. No, it's not. Because basically that ignores all of the contributions that were made by different parts of the African world to the construction of this thing that we think of as Black America. And the different populations coming in have brought made different political contributions. For example, the Caribbean diaspora particularly brought in and strengthened trade unionism. But it also strengthened in general the idea of class politics and a lot of radicalism. Not everyone was radical. Garvey wasn't. I mean, it was actually quite conservative, despite the fact that the movement was the largest black movement historically in North America. But you also have people like Cyril Briggs and others of the Caribbean background. If you eliminate that, it's like taking the lungs out of someone and saying, well, you should keep breathing, right? It's impossible. And so I think we've got to start there with that recognition of the way that Black America as a notion has transformed over time, and the different political contributions that are not always progressive, but the different political contributions that have been made. And let me just say one other thing at the risk of going on until 5 o'clock. One of the things about black folks and labor that relates to something that Cedric was saying is that black folks, Latinos, and Asians have been treated up until the 1970s in most U.S. labor as the beneficiaries of what white folks did, or we were kind of the last at the table. And it ignored the different things that we did beginning at the end of the Civil War. I mean, you could actually go back to the 1850s, but I'm going to stick with like 1866. From that point on, whether it was strikes that were going on from 1866 to 1868 in the South, whether it was a colored national labor union, whether it was the development of the Knights of Labor and the significant role of African American workers, whether it was the independent formations among peoples of color that were focused on labor. The National Alliance of Postal and Federal Employees was a largely black union. You started to see in the Southwest the contributions of Chicanos. And also, interestingly, the relationship between, this is going beyond black folks, but the relationship of the Mexican labor movement to the development of the U.S. trade union movement, which no U.S. union that I know of has ever acknowledged, nor has there ever been acknowledgement of the Congress of Spanish-speaking Peoples, right, which was central in the organizing of the CIO in the Southwest. So we actually built the damn labor movement. If it wasn't for us, there would be no labor movement as we see it. And my final point is this. You want to know an example? It's of Ford Motors. And I always get on the busted chops of UAW people because I asked them, you know how Ford Motors was organized? No. I said, well, it was organized because of the National Negro Congress and the NAACP in unity with the UAW. Had it not been for that, because Henry Ford was a very, very outstanding fascist and anti-Semite. He was a strategist. He understood how to divide people. And so the UAW could organize GM and Chrysler. They could not organize Ford. And it was us that made a difference. And yet, if you ask the UAW to this day, even progressive people in the UAW, I'll bet you $1 to a donut, they don't know this history. We built the movement. We should never walk away from that.
No, see, Bill did warn me about this problem, but I sort of think of it as the rewards are far greater than the risks. I think importantly, we also might want to know, to add on to Bill's point, the stakes of what and who is considered black are extraordinarily important and prescient throughout U.S. history. By all means.
Yeah, I'd like to add to all the things that Bill said, but not just a question of what is black or who is black, but a question of who is the labor movement, which is what I was hinting at a little bit before. I think if we have this narrow view that labor organizations are the statutory things under the National Labor Relations Act, we will miss the entire history of Black labor activists who fall outside of that statutory framework very intentionally and also now. And if we do that, we miss also all the great labor activists of today who might be organizing outside of Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act. I will bring attention to, some organizing that's going on with Jobs to Move America, whom I'm affiliated with, but they just had a press release yesterday about organizing at Hyundai, where there is prison labor working next to what they call free labor. Those folks in Alabama have laws against their ability to organize into a trade union, and so there's a lot of exciting innovative organizing that's going on if we expand our definition outside of a statute that was never meant to include us, and see that there's a lot of things going on the ground right now, particularly in response to this question of authoritarianism or abuse of state power. So.
And I just want to say the names of the people who were the black nucleus of the United Auto Workers in the 1940s, right? Like just in the language of the 2020 uprising, because we don't talk about we don't say their names, right? C. LeBron Simmons, Vera Vandenberg, and Coleman Young, who became mayor of Detroit. That was the nucleus of the organizing committee that organized Ford Motor Company in 1941.
Now, naming is extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily important to both understanding movements, broadly speaking. I would like to maybe ask this panel maybe a follow-up and/or inspired by Tammy's articulations of state violence and of state imposition. How has Black activists, Black organizations resisted, pushed back, fought against a state apparatus that is uniquely suited for suppressing Black movements violently and non-violently at times throughout the 20th century?
Okay, so I'll say this about authoritarianism and state violence towards Black workers. So, but I'm going to take it from the other direction. So a lot of the data that comes that I use for the book actually comes from state surveillance records. Okay, I did use the minutes and letters of Black labor activists, but a huge treasure trove, okay, of the data that appears in this book comes from reports from FBI agents and the precursors to the CIA. Okay, and the reason why that is because the state was trying to build a case against Black workers who were organizing unions that they were fundamentally disloyal to the United States. Okay? So the very fact that a lot of the sources for my book come from these state surveillance records, I think is telling about how much of a threat, right, interracial solidarity and Black labor activism was both to the state and to the capitalist system. Because the idea was that if Black and white workers organized across the color line, then the entire system was in jeopardy. The other thing that I will say about this is that, you know, the Black workers who are featured in Freedom Train did organize lots of industrial workers into the union movement. But that was not the overarching strategy. That wasn't their political vision. What they believed that they were doing was they were fighting fascism at home and abroad. okay? The way that they thought about what they were doing was that we are, like especially in the 1930s, we are fighting Jim Crow unionism. In other words, we're fighting fascism in the labor movement here in the United States, okay? Which of course, was very much linked to state violence against black workers. But they also understood that they were fighting against fascism abroad, German Nazism, Japanese imperialism of all kinds. And so not only was the state violence present and they were organizing around it, and state agencies were infiltrating black labor organizations, but their political vision, right, was informed by the most violent political tendency of their time, which was fascism, okay? And Cameron and I have talked about this, right? They were very conscious about this. They called it the double V strategy: victory at home and victory abroad. Fascism, state authoritarianism, and political violence were always at the front of their minds. Yes, they were organizing, but they were organizing for a reason, and that was fundamentally to defeat the far right.
It's what I was thinking about in the question is that there is state repression and there is fascism, and then there's paramilitary activity by the right. And one of the mistakes that many left and progressive people make is that anything that we don't like about the current society, we identify as fascist. So if someone is assassinated, if someone is jailed, we say it's fascist. And the problem with that is that it misunderstands the nature of so-called democratic capitalism. Democratic capitalism is very vicious, it's very violent, but it's a particular form of rule. Calling it democratic doesn't mean it's nice. It just means it's a different form of rule, and that there are other forms of rule, including fascism, which tends to be based on a social movement. So it's not a military coup, but it's when you're talking about a well-organized social movement that is seeking to overthrow all elements of democratic capitalism. And one of the things that we've had to deal with is not just state repression, but the interplay between state and extrajudicial violence. So, for example, in the Reconstruction period, how black folks responded to repression, the repression was mainly coming from extrajudicial violence, white terrorists, the KKK, the Knights of the White Camellia, etc., was armed. There were these things called the Union Leagues that were mixed. Anyone could be in them. And they were armed, and they would often resist the paramilitaries. Just as a slight side note, ironically, the Secret Service, the U.S. Secret Service, was very effective in destroying the first realm of the KKK. But there was not a continuation of the needed suppression of those forces so they could grow. They ended up growing again. So we've always had to deal with state and extra-state violence. If you look at the pogroms of the 1917 through 1921, the so-called race riots, I think pogrom is a better term. These were mass attacks on black communities, beginning East St. Louis and going at least through Tulsa. There was this collaboration between extrajudicial and state forces to carry out these reigns of terror. Organizations like the Black Legion in the 1930s, which was very vehemently anti-union, got support from Henry Ford was also kind of a northern version of the KKK. And that kind of repression, when the Cold War moves against organized labor, black trade unionists were some of the first victims of this. And one of the interesting side notes is one of the ways that communists were identified, white communists, by the FBI was people would ask, do they have black friends? And that was one of the criterias that was used. So we've always had this combination of judicial and extrajudicial repression. And what we went through in the Jim Crow South deeply resembles fascism. What we're looking at right now, I would argue, is neo-fascism. And it is qualitatively different than things that we've gone through before.
Thanks. I'm thinking about how I want to enter this conversation. I think I might bring us up to contemporary responses of black workers, like what they're doing right now, which is steeped in all the history that was just given, especially what Bill's talking about in terms of extrajudicial. I'm looking at how black workers in places like Amazon warehouses, for example, particularly in the southern United States, where Amazon is opening these facilities basically on site of old plantations, right? And when you move down there and you talk to the workers, you feel all the things in the air and the trees, right? The history is very thick. And what has come to our attention as researchers when we think about black responses to what we've called the militarization of employment relations. Amazon using military-style tactics, blurring the line between state power and corporate power, has always been a thing that black workers have faced historically, right? This blurring of the lines between corporate and state power, the use of police, the use of white civilians to police black bodies, plantation management, or its precursor, which is agricultural management, right? Sort of like the precursor to scientific management and what we do in factories and warehouses. So what are black workers responding to? What are our tools? A lot of the same tactical repertoires are still there. We're still using things that are in our collective histories, that are in our blood, that are from our ancestors. One of the things that I want to shine a light on is the resilience, right, in face of whoever the opponent is, which is big, state and corporate power. There have been so many discussions, the way we think about whether or not an organizing campaign has won or lost, right? We usually measure it by, did they win that election in Alabama? They still haven't lost that election at Amazon, by the way. But we largely will critique them and say it was a failure because they didn't win. But if you go down there and talk to any worker who's been involved in the 3 elections that they've had there, you will see power, you will see hope, you will see agency, you will see blueprints, right? You will see cross-ethnic, cross-racial organizing, right? In ways that tie what is happening in the workplace to greater political participation in the US democracy. That also means that black workers are labor educators. They are instruments of democratic processes, right? And if we center our understanding of what the labor movement is doing in their experiences, imagination opens up to what comes after, right? These critical junctures of state and corporate power that are being abused.
So I think in that vein, I would like to maybe ask maybe an interrelated Yet, I think, powerful and important question. With the, as Bill noted, the unique extrajudicial fused with state violence approach towards Black activists, Black unionists, how did these people and organizations build a interracial and cross-class movement? How did this actually happen, and how is it still happening at present? I think it's kind of important for us to realize that this movement for interracial, interclass solidarity is not finished, right? This is an ongoing, critically important discussion and an argument that we are still having at present.
So I think it's important to talk about the different ways in which Black workers tried to get the organized labor movement to adopt this vision of interracial solidarity. Because it wasn't all the same, okay? So I'll just use two examples because I think they provide a helpful contrast. So A. Philip Randolph, possibly the most famous Black trade unionist in America, the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and many independent Black labor organizations. For most of his career, the tactic that he used was to organize people internal to the bureaucracy. In other words, work within the American Federation of Labor to try to get them to allow the affiliation of Black-led unions like the sleeping car porters into the AFL, okay? Failing that, once Randolph realized that the organization he was working with at the time was not moving the needle, he then resorted to a different tactic, okay, which you may have all heard of, which is called the March on Washington, okay? He did so in 1941 and was able to pressure Franklin Delano Roosevelt into signing Executive Order 8802, which made it illegal for the defense industry and defense unions to discriminate against Black workers. And he later did that, of course, in 1963, when after many decades of trying to pressure the labor movement to impose interracial discipline on their local and state affiliates, they refused. And so his approach then was, okay, let's engage in direct action, let's do mass mobilization in the nation's capital and make the state impose that discipline upon organized labor so that organized labor will do what is right. Those were a distinctive set of tactics, but they were not the only ones, okay? So the approach of the National Negro Congress, in partnership with some of the experiments in the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and in conscious partnership actually with the Communist Party, believed that the way to create an interracial movement was to organize Black people into the union movement, okay? And to move beyond organizing by craft or trade, from which Black people were just uniformly excluded anyway, but to organizing workplaces wall to wall on an industrial basis. And so these particular Black cadres believed that what we needed to do was target the industries where Black people were disproportionately concentrated. Steel, auto, tobacco, and meatpacking, right? The dirtiest possible jobs, menial manual labor, and so forth, right? This is where Black folks were concentrated within industry at that time. And what the National Negro Congress did in the 1930s was to organize those folks into the union movement. And their belief was, once we organize Black folks into the unions, we will no longer have second-class citizenship in those unions, Eventually, black people will rise to positions of power in elected leadership, and then the organizations as a whole would then be programmatically committed to the dual fight, the twin fight for economic and racial justice, right? So I would say, if you're asking about the how, those were kind of like the main tactics that at least the people in my book utilized, right? Affiliation, working through the internal bureaucracy of the American Federation of Labor, direct action against the state through the March on Washington, and the organization of industrial workers, black industrial workers, into the union movement.
I don't want to get us lost in the weeds of definitions and conceptualizations. I come out of critical race theory and intersectional theory, and I tend to distinguish between intersectionality or intersectional organizing and multiracial organizing or interracial organizing. There's a power thing that happens there. But what I will say is, like, because that's my theoretical framework for looking at class issues, what I think is, I look to the black feminist scholars, the black liberation thinkers, the black abolitionists for what has been a long-standing reframing of the class question in what's happening to the most marginalized as opposed to what's happening to the most privileged in the working class. Right, so let me give you some examples that I wrote down. Like Anna Julia Cooper, a century ago, sociologist, black liberation activist, and she argues that the only true measure of the condition of the working class as a whole was a conceptualization that took into account the overlapping oppressions faced by the most marginalized groups. So again, one of the things we do when black women lead is that we immediately reframe the class question in the most marginalized, right? That is helpful in putting us and unifying us across differences as opposed to downplaying identity and trying to create solidarity around some unified class question, right? So it's a deeper conceptualization of class, but it's also a rejection of colorblind solidarity building. Another example, which is Claudia Jones, and she names black women. She goes, the triply oppressed status of black women is a barometer of the status of all women, and that the fight for full economic and political and social equality of black women is in the vital self-interest of white workers and in the vital interest of the fight to realize equality for all women. So we can't understand how white women are subordinated without understanding how black women are subordinated, because white women are subordinated based on how poorly we treat black women, right? So that is a long history of black feminist organizing that we bring when we are placed in decision-making positions and supported in order to drive movements. And the last thing I'll say as an example from my research is when I was deeply embedded in the 2017 Women's March, National Women's March, right? Which started with two white women who did a social media post, and a bunch of people were like, yeah, we gotta take down Trump, right? And they got a bunch of critique, right? Mostly from black folks, but definitely from black feminists saying, you have taken the March on Washington out of its roots in black people. You have no one of color in leadership. You've got to change that. And at that minute, the Women's March shifts when they bring on Tamika Mallory, who was the black co-chair, Carmen Perez was the Chicana co-chair, and Linda Sarsour, who was the Palestinian activist. They all come together with the white organizer, Bob Bland, who's a great ally. But they sit down and they do the very hard work of intersectional organizing. I would argue that when Women's March stopped doing the hard work of intersectional organizing is when they lost power. But the hard work is you have to set an intersectional culture, and the only way to do that is to rooted in the most marginalized groups. And so they did a lot of education of folks holding privileges, including within community, right? Black, cisgendered women, not understanding trans women of color, et cetera. So reframing interracial, multiracial movement building in the most vulnerable as opposed to the most privileged, and being very honest and acknowledging doing the hard work is what Black women can bring to those types of movements.
This question that you're posing, it really gives me pause. I would say that one response by Black workers has to do with understanding the moment. It's not an accident that you would have these strikes in the South, 1866 to 1868, because it was Reconstruction. There were federal troops there, right? And so there was an environment in which these workers could organize, strike, and win. And that's very important. Another key moment was during the Depression, and not because of the Depression, but because of the development of the Committee on Industrial Organization, which later becomes the Congress of Industrial Organizations, that what the white leaders of those unions understood was that there would be no success unless African Americans, Latinos, and Asians were part of the equation. Now, they had overall a fairly primitive idea, that is the white leaders, about what that meant. But what they were doing was breaking from the essentially apartheid trade unionism of the AFL. And so at that moment, some great visionaries within Black America who went on to form the National Negro Congress realized the importance of the moment. This was a moment. This was not a moment to sit back. It wasn't a moment to hope that white people were going to act differently. This was a moment to intervene. And that's what they did. And played a very, very important role in organizing around the country, steel workers, the auto workers, tobacco workers, et cetera. They played a very central role. It was understanding the moment, which is something that's eluded many of us. The other two things is that there was a lot of Black interest in the industrial workers of the world, but the Black workforce looked very different at the high point of the IWW. Black workers, you could find them particularly in longshore and in mining, but it's in the period that begins more or less around 1915 with the second great migration of African Americans out of the South, going north and entering into the manufacturing workforce, that the conditions change such that we become an integral component of this developing new union movement of the 1930s. The final point was the critical role of communists. And a lot of people don't want to talk about it, but I think that it's without question that Black and white and Latino communists were at the forefront of pushing, wherever they were, pushing for whatever you want to call it, multiracial, whatever, unionism, genuine unionism. They were at the forefront of that. And this, they were engaged in multiple fights, and those influenced by them. I mean, people like Harry Bridges. Whether Harry Bridges was a communist or not is irrelevant. What's important was that The politics he brought to unionizing on the West Coast was extraordinary. And the recognition that he had that the black communities, as small as they were in the Bay Area, would be really critical with what became the San Francisco General Strike. That he went to black communities and said, I want your support, because what we're going to do through this general strike and through fighting for the hiring hall will break the arbitrary way that hiring was done, an arbitrary way which always disadvantaged black workers. And he stood by that, and the black community rallied to him, and it was significant to me, growing up in New York. So we're 3,000 miles away from the West Coast. But when my father would talk about trade unionism, he'd say, Bill, there's always been two kinds of unions in this country. There were the corrupt and racist building trades, and then there was the real unionism of Harry Bridges. Right? This is in New York, right? He didn't say like the ILA, he said Harry Bridges. And that it was something that spread throughout black America, that Harry Bridges was a hero within black America, because people understood where he and where the ILWU stood on these questions.
I think importantly to sort of note that for black activists, labor activism fused with social activism, which fused with political activism. We have these overlapping and mutually reinforcing behaviors of social, labor, and political organization that ultimately played, I would say, a gargantuan role in pushing the labor movement and redefining the labor movement as a social movement. I think we have about 25 minutes. We might want to open it up to you all for questions.
We have completed question forms. We're going to go around and collect them right now. If you guys want to go on first, maybe 5 more minutes, and then we'll be ready with some questions for you.
Yeah, sure. So, oh dear, going on for 5 more minutes. This is a tempting amount of power that you have given to me, which I will attempt to use responsibly.
I could do a little storytelling.
By all means.
Yeah, Bill's last comments sort of opened up something for me, and I feel like I want to do a bit of storytelling if you would be so patient to listen. And this is on the question of black activism versus labor activists, right? My grandfather was, in fact, part of that second migration from Memphis, Tennessee, headed to Chicago for work, but stopped and landed in Indiana, where I was born, South Bend, Indiana, because he crossed a picket line at Studebaker. The UAW was there, crossed the picket line to integrate that workforce, right? He gets in an industrial accident, loses 3 of his fingers. I grow up in the backyard listening to my grandfather say all kinds of words about the racist union UAW. I grew up, first person to go to college from my family, and I become an industrial engineer. How? Why? Because my grandfather taught me that we have to protect workers, and I thought the best way to do that, since unions were racist, was to actually be the one who built the factory or the workplace, right? I was going to protect them through ergonomics, through design, etc. I say all this to sort of bring to light this idea that I've always been a black activist. My grandfather is a black labor activist. Was he in the trade union? No. mostly, I think I actually think it was segregated still. So he was not in the UAW. He was a scab, but was he also a labor activist who was responsible for getting more and more black people integrated into that workplace? Absolutely. Was I an activist, but also an industrial engineer? Yes, I was. The question is, really at its root, and I think this is where Cameron was taking us a little bit, or maybe Bill when he brought up communism, but a lot of the discussion we've had so far has missed, until just now, an anti-capitalist conversation that I think black people have always been aware of, especially those of you who do racial capitalism, about how the systemic oppression is built in and perpetrated by the system, right? In some ways, people would argue that the system is acting exactly as it was designed to act. And so when it is about economic justice, when it's about liberation, when it's about abolition, how can we do that if we don't also have a critique then of the capitalist systems, but also the capitalist unions, right, who are out there fighting for, justice for all, right? Has it ever been true in our history that an injury to one was felt the same by all? Yeah.
A couple of quick things. One is that one of the big challenges for black workers is that we're not organizing in South Africa or Algeria or Kenya. We're organizing in the United States where we are a minority. And that means that we are constantly in search of allies and comrades. And this is one of the ongoing challenges for black workers. Who are our comrades? And how to hold people accountable, and how to make sure that the instruments of labor organization are truly about pushing the envelope, extending democracy, breaking down barriers, as opposed to being instruments to keep us restricted. So for example, in the CIO, what's interesting is two different examples. One was the steel workers and the other was the packing house workers. So the steel workers would go into steel mills and they would successfully organize, but they would not challenge the racial hierarchy. So the standard of living for the African Americans, the Chicanos working there, would go up, but they'd still be in the most dangerous jobs lower down, right? And the union refused to do anything about that. Take a different model, packing house workers. Packing house workers under left leadership had a very different approach, and one of the things that they did was that they took on racial discrimination in the hiring that was going on in the packing house industry, which a lot of unions refused to do, because they'd say, well, we'll take care of things once you're here. But the packing house workers said, no, we're going to challenge the way the industry hires people, which I would argue is still a novel concept, because I don't know any unions that are really taking that kind of thing on. So but there was real organization among the black workers within the packing house union. The final thing is just something about repression in this moment. So Cedric mentioned A. Philip Randolph, who was a really complicated historical figure, which we could have a whole discussion about, right? But one of the things he did when he basically forced Roosevelt to blink and sign the executive orders was of historic proportions. The response to this between 1941 and 45 were wave after wave of hate strikes that were carried out by white racists to prevent the hiring of black workers. A friend of mine, Tej Nagaraja, is writing this book about U.S. in World War II and domestically. And there's this whole chapter about the hate strikes. And I'm going to encourage people, when the book comes out, grab it, right? Because what's interesting is that it was a moment when these hate strikes are going on. And think about it for a second. It was not clear who was going to win World War II until the Battle of Midway and the Battle of Stalingrad. But yet these racists were carrying out strikes that inhibited war production in the United States. They were more concerned about keeping black folks out than they were about winning. And in that situation, union leaders had to decide which side were they on. Were they on the side of their members who were doing these wildcats, or were they going to take the side of those against them? And most of the union leaders actually stood against their own members, that is, against the racists who were carrying out these wildcats. They stood against them. And I'm saying that because right now we have a situation where we're up against neo-fascism, and there's too many union leaders that are saying, no, we can't say anything, Bill, because, we got MAGA people in our ranks. And I'm saying, the hell with that. Yes, you represent them on wages, hours, and working conditions, but you cannot let them be an anchor that holds you back from taking a stand against fascism, right? You cannot allow that. And that's the message I think that is really important for us all to walk away with when we're going back to our unions.
Okay, folks, so we're going to start with a couple of written questions that have been submitted to the panel, and then we're going to come out here and take live questions from you all if you want to voice your questions. We'll do a couple there, a couple written, and back and forth. So if at any point, raise your hand if you want to speak, and we'll put you in the queue.
For those who wrote in their questions, thank you so much. I've taken a peek at them, and they are, I think, all very particularly interesting. I'd like to read one. My question is inspired by something that Tammy said, that black workers have always fought for more than just wages. What do you have to say to those who argue that black working class people are, or should be, more concerned with bread and butter issues than things like racism and sexism? How is the fight for dignity, either in the workplace or society at large, related to the fight for economic justice?
Woo! Okay. Was that just directed at me? I hope everybody answers this question. I actually don't know if I fully understand the hierarchy of humanization and economic interest. I feel like one of the things that happens when you're in a black or brown body is that you cannot separate these things, right? This is sort of the basis of intersectionality. What are wages, hours, and working conditions if I can't survive a routine traffic stop? I can't, other than that, I don't really know what to say. Yeah. I mean, I don't actually feel like I need to answer the question. I feel like black leaders have answered this question over and over again. I think one of the issues for the labor movement, if we reframe it and try to deal with the question that way, is and this is, again, me bringing forward this idea of capitalism, and Bill talked a little bit about what happens when unions internalize the racial hierarchies that exist, right? And in a capitalist model, when there's racial hierarchies, it creates a situation where the unions then are recreating the harm to workers who are racially or otherwise marginalized. And so that, to me, I like to say this occasionally, is trickle-down social justice. You are normalizing the idea that it's okay that black folks are less safe than other folks because you're more interested in your wages, hours, and working conditions, which, by the way, as I said earlier, have always been pegged to how little we can pay black workers and how little we can protect black workers in the workplace. So that's what I would say. Also, I just think, I would challenge folks to decenter whiteness in those kind of questions and recenter the narrative in the most oppressed, whether that be black people or other folks. And we can talk about immigrants right now who are definitely the targets of some very cruel attacks right now. So would we ask someone who is being pursued by ICE how they could explain why, their safety, their democracy, their participation is less important or on some sort of competitive analysis with economic issues.
I just want to add really quickly, and I agree with Tammy that like you can't actually separate racial from economic justice. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is that in the period that I'm writing about in Freedom Train, Black people were completely excluded from the labor movement. And that created a crisis of unemployment in the Black community, right? So we could talk about wages, working conditions, and benefits. But if Black people are facing a color bar from unions, how are they even supposed to benefit from these so-called wages, hours and working conditions? And just in case anybody thinks that all is now past, right? Yeah, I worked in Rhode Island for 11 years. The plumbers local in Rhode Island had one Black member, okay? So trades unions are changing, but I would say there are definitely sectors of the labor movement that are still almost exclusively white and not by accident.
Saludo. I am really pleased, and every time I'm distressed because I cannot applaud. I have a broken bone in my right wrist, but I wanted really to bring something that both Ms. Lee and Brother Fletcher raised, and it's the question, who is Black in this country? And I thought that it was interesting that Ms. Lee raised Gloria Jones, who was born in Port of Spain, Trinidad, and is now buried to the left of Karl Marx in London. And it was a labor leader right here in New York that got deported by the United States, just like they deported Marcus Garvey. And it's fascinating with Garvey, he was not super radical, but Marcus Garvey organized banana plantations in Costa Rica. And to this day, there is a statue of Marcus Garvey in Puerto Limón in Costa Rica, recognizing his contribution to the organizing of agricultural workers in the Caribbean, English, Spanish, and French. But Mr. Fletcher, you brought a question of the contribution and the participation that who is Black goes beyond the people that were descendants of enslaved people in the North, because enslaved people began to arrive the same day that Columbus got lost and was found by the Native Americans. Okay, I consider myself Afro-Dominican. And I remember getting engaged in the movement for the liberation of South Africa and Nelson Mandela, and people telling me, you're not Black, you're Spanish. And I said, wait. I speak Spanish because the colonizers dropped us in different islands and they spoke different languages. But in this current time, how do we begin also translating those lessons and creating a closer connections between the unions, the struggle for immigrants, and this is a country of immigrants. The only non-immigrants here are the Native Americans and the African American people that came here because they did not ask anybody to bring them here. There were millions of them that died in the transatlantic trade. But how do we begin to broaden the understanding and engaging all of us in the same conversation? I'm sorry.
We're going to voice one more question.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks to all the panelists. This was great. My question is for Cedric. Much of the literature on early 20th century interracial unionism tends to emphasize, and I'm thinking of like Moon Ki-jung's classic work on interracialism in Hawaii among Filipino, Japanese, and Portuguese workers, and then Zofia Edwards' recent book on Indian and Afro-Caribbean workers in Trinidad Tobago. That work tends to emphasize mixed race, working class, co-articulating a racial identity, and working out interracial hostilities and divisions. And it seems like in a lot of the examples you give, it's more a story of a subordinate race forcing a dominant white, working class to integrate their unions. And so I'm just wondering if you see any of this like Edwards or Jung type interracial unionism operative in the history that you're studying, and also whether you see any need for further clarification or interrogation of this concept of interracial unionism as per your fascinating research.
Thanks, Sam. I planted her here so that I would get a question. I'm just playing. Okay. Yes. So most of the examples that I have in the book are really of basically black folks forcing the question. And to the sister's point, right? These are not just African Americans. Many of them were also Caribbean Americans as well. And one of the people who was deported alongside the brother you mentioned was Wilfredo Domingo, who is also a Caribbean socialist in the middle of the 20th century. So there is a very interesting example of multiracial organizing in the book, and it takes up a whole chapter, and it's the National Negro Labor Council of the 1950s. This is the preeminent independent black labor organization of the 1950s, and this was a multiracial group consisting of black-led unions, black communists, but also white progressives, including socialists and communists, including Harry Bridges, by the way, and another named Maurice Travis, who was a trade unionist, a white trade unionist from the South. But what is so interesting about the NNLC, Sam, is that not only was it multiracial, but white workers came to the conventions, came into the space, and looked to black workers for leadership. And as a matter of fact, what Maurice Travis did, and Maurice Travis has a lot of credibility among the black working class community in this period because he was shot at by the Klan for defending a picket line, a multiracial picket line in Alabama. And Maurice Travis goes to a convention, as a matter of fact, an NLC convention, and he says, I'm not here to lecture black people about how to organize, okay? Because we've had a lot of that activity over the last several decades, and look where it's gotten us, right? I'm here to work with black workers so that I can understand how I can be helpful and organize white workers to a progressive vision of interracial solidarity. So it's an instance of multiracial of a multiracial movement. But what is so interesting is that they accepted the leadership of black workers in that moment. And I think that is the kind of way, I think that even today, that, we should all be entering these spaces, right? Like not with privilege, not thinking that, well, I know what's going on. I know what's good for you. Just stick with me and I'll set you free, right? But is that kind of, let's say, humility, right? About the struggles of other people that are different from yourself.
So two things.
If I could just let people know really quick, excuse me, Bill. The panel has graciously agreed to stay past our 2 o'clock end time because it seems like there's tons of good questions out here. So we encourage folks to stay, and thank you, panel.
I told y'all we're going to stay till 5. Some people were laughing, but so I actually want 2 things. One, to pick up on something that Tamara was raising, but from a different angle. Here's the problem. There is regularly an argument that's raised that we should build unity based on things that we share in common. And we hear it again and again. In the New York mayor's race, and in the aftermath of that, discussions have been raised about, is the unity to be built around kitchen table issues, people's similar sufferings, and that you leave some of these other matters aside. This is an ongoing debate, and this is a debate that we have to join. Because it keeps coming up. It keeps being raised. It gets raised by some leftists. It gets raised by more traditional trade unionists and other people outside of the union movement. You keep hearing the same thing, that we should come together based on what we share in common, and we can take care of the other things later. And the problem is that, just on a practical level, it doesn't work. You know, in 1892, there was a general strike in New Orleans, very famous, and was led by dock workers. And the dock workers were segregated. They had a white local and a black local. And the owners were coming down on, I believe, the black local. And they joined together and they fought and they defeated the employers. The employers brought in militia and everything, and they won. The next year was the Great Depression of 1893, second only to the Great Depression in the 1930s in terms of its devastation. And all of the unity that came in 1892 around common trade union issues evaporated almost overnight, and these black and white dock workers were literally killing each other trying to fight for jobs. As the saying goes, if you don't hit it, it won't fall. And there's a constant attempt by segments of the left and the trade union movement to avoid so-called divisive issues in the name of building unity. And it does not work. And it lays, you could see it. I remember when, what's his name, who ran for president in 92. Pat Buchanan. You could read some of Pat Buchanan's speeches and think he was a Marxist unless you read the whole thing. And then you'd realize, this guy is not, he is on the right, he's a right-wing populist. But there were trade union leaders that would be saying, no, Pat Buchanan's cool, let's just listen to him on trade union issues. But no, wait a minute, he's talking about building a movement without me. He's talking about building a movement on top of people that look like me. So why should I find unity with that, right? So that's why we can't avoid this question. We got to defeat it. And in terms of the point that you were raising, Estrella, about building connections, one thing I would recommend is that people should watch Raoul Peck's Exterminate All the Brutes. It's on HBO. It is one of the most brilliant documentaries I've seen that looks at the relationship of the construction of the United States, the issue of race. It also ties in with the Holocaust in interesting ways. Part of what we have to do is a profound educational effort within our ranks. And speaking to black folks across the board don't understand black folks. We just don't. And we don't understand, for instance, that Afro-Latinos, coming from Latin America, you had a different experience with white supremacy than those of us under British white supremacy. It wasn't better, it wasn't worse, it was different. But it transformed people's consciousness. Thus, when I go to Latin America and people say, Bill, what are you? And I say, I'm black, And this is, no, not exactly. And I'll turn it into a joke and I'll say, but if I land in New York and say I'm anything other than black, I'll be put in an insane asylum. So what explains the difference? That's what we don't appreciate. And that's what we got to talk about. That's what, I mean, the union education has to transform itself so we're dealing with these kinds of issues.
Okay, I wanted to maybe circle back a little bit, but challenge us all to think about these things. I routinely tell my students this when we talk about race, like what is it? And class, what is it? And this tendency to see race conversation in the U.S. as dominated by folks of color. Black folks are obsessed with it, et cetera. But this is where the critical race theorists really help us, right? Because they have this whole thing where they discuss whiteness as property, as a foundational concept of the U.S. experiment in colonialism. So if we think of whiteness as property, and we think about the history of the United States, who actually is obsessed with race? It's about protecting whiteness. It always has been. Your ability to enter the class was conditioned on whether or not you were a certain color, right? The condition for being free, a person, participation, has always been on that construction of whiteness, and that was used against white folks now, or folks who are considered white now who weren't considered white then, right? So, and all the black codes that followed the Civil War, right? And we haven't mentioned the American eugenics movement, but all of those codes are fueled by preserving white racial purity. The forcing us to segregate, the prohibitions against interracial marriage, those were all about protecting race by white people. So we're responding to a deeply held white supremacy movement in this country, which was never eradicated. So the question for everybody to consider is like, who exactly is obsessed with race and who is just trying to survive and thrive in the context of it, right? And also to consider what is class, right? Is not class racialized, gendered, abled, right? To be considered part of the labor movement and to hold work in this country at different points and critical junctures of our history precluded large groups of people who are sitting in this room, right? So that to sort of think that we could separate very easily the construction of race from the construction of class or any other social identity, I think is a fool's errand, although we do it all the time.
We have some questions over here, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for being here today. My name is Tafadar. I'm from Laborers Local 79. I just want to start off by giving a shout out to my brother Jarrell Gibbs here, who was recently recognized as a Labor's Rising Young Star by the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, New York City chapter. So I actually wrote my question down, and I'm just going to read it off the paper. So construction has historically been one of the most segregated and racially tribalistic industries by virtue of the design of the bosses. And in New York City, black workers in the 60s and the 70s formed organizations called coalitions to fight for access to jobs. And it was these struggles that led to conscious civil rights leaders in our industry like Jim Horton, founder of Harlem Fight Back, emerging to bring together struggles in the communities and workplaces as one terrain of building worker power and construction. And especially nowadays, as young politically conscious activists are looking to be part of building the labor movement as a means of fighting back against the oppression and exploitation caused by capitalism and emerging fascism, I think it's important to have clarity on the relationship of racial oppression to class exploitation, specifically on what it means on how community organizing is going to play a role in building a multiracial labor movement that prioritizes liberation for all people. And just like a quick example, in our own work in the construction industry, you can't organize black construction workers without also fighting against court-ordered surveillance and mass incarceration, and all of that gets pulled into the labor movement that we are building. But that's our neck of the woods in construction, so I was wondering what your thoughts are on what that looks like for the labor movement overall. Thank you.
I'm going to voice another question before we get answers.
Hi. Kind of similarly to the question that came right before me, my name is Susan, and I work in media. I work at the News Guild. And media has always been deeply segregated, and certainly black communities have had their own independent press, and it's a long tradition. But the reality is that when we're talking about mainstream corporate media, you're talking about a very narrow kind of viewpoint that is distributed across the country and informs how people think about the fights that we're talking about. And one of the challenges, and I am interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts about this, is that there is a kind of unspoken expectation in all the work that you're doing about the emotional labor that's required in these leadership positions in organizing. If I had a dollar for every time someone told me just hire a black woman, I would be wealthy and not living here. And that's an extremely damaging and destructive kind of thought when you're talking about multiracial, intergenerational, progressive organizing in established unions, right? It is something that is an impediment for people staying in the industry, because on top of all the other things that they deal with, now they've got to do the emotional labor of bringing along their colleagues about why the fight is important, why their fortunes are tied to the fortunes of all the other people that are either absent from the newsroom or whose voices they're supposed to represent, and they have to fight to get into the discourse. So I'm curious particularly about this issue of emotional labor, which is kind of an expectation when we talk about leadership that is black, Latino, Asian, or any other community that is kind of suffering under the yoke of white supremacy, and how we address that.
Let's just voice one more question, please.
Greetings, comrades and fellow informants in the room. I'm going to frame my question with this thought. I was born in the 50s, lived through the Cold War and so on and so, and it also has to do with education. My uncle was in the Army and was stationed in Berlin during the Berlin airlift. The Berlin airlift was like a 24/7 hour food aid and everything else. But I'm extending the vision of that. I don't see an airlift for Haiti. I don't see an airlift for Jamaica. I don't see an airlift for the Gaza Strip. Oh, one plane dropped 7 pallets on the people, not on the ground. I don't see an airlift for the Sudan. We got planes that are 3 times the size of what was dealing with in Berlin. And by the way, that's when there was a draft. A lot of black soldiers worked 15-hour days unloading those planes to feed white folk that basically just had a war with. Now, I'm not against that, but think about that and we need to organize the neighborhood and educate our children. Don't offer up our children for 30 pieces of silver to be basically brutalizing somebody else down at 26 Federal Plaza, okay? Walk away from that money. That's not money, okay? And there's a reason why, and you should explain, I would like, oh, by the way, there was a name, the female that you left out, Addie Wyatt in Chicago. That name should be raised. There's a book, go get it, read it. She was an organizer, and a lot of her issues were, well, housing and everything else. Also, as I said, the National Alliance, we need to have, in the education piece, we need to be writing our history. There was a vice president of the National Alliance. There's a book called There's Always Work at the Post Office. His picture is in there. I know about that picture because I was on the boat. I'm the one that pressed the button on the camera, and as a little kid. But his name is not mentioned in the boat, on the book at all. He took a lot of the progressive things that union did in reference to civil rights and so on. He was involved in starting and doing. And if you're in the union, take your kids. They'll learn something, because I was taken along. I learned the word comrade when I was a kid, because the National Alliance used to call each other comrades. The last name, the name that's missing, is McCants. He was the first black postmaster of Jersey City, and he was also acting postmaster in Brooklyn, but Reagan wouldn't give him the full-time job. His name is on the, go down to Brooklyn Post Office and look at it. These things we need to do and organize. Also, that strike in '68. There's a case where black workers, my mother opened up the school in '68 because of what was going down. We gained something and then we got it lost, we gave it up. And I can't say any more about the auto and so on and so forth, but I can tell you about the, I'm gonna leave it with this. That visual aid agency known as media, I know about that. I'm a commercial photographer. The only way I can get in the door is I changed my first name. I shortened it. My full name is Solomon, but I said Saul. I get to the door and I got the door slammed in my face. Sometimes I stuck my foot in the door. But the shameful, shameful thing is those that are on the television that got there by a struggle, and they're betraying the ones that came before. A lot of these people are now being like little orphan Annie, wearing yellow dresses forever. If you knew the true history of the Ukraine, you wouldn't wear yellow and what they did in North Africa. That's not taught what was done in North Africa to black people. And the Holocaust, there were black people first in concentration camps, and they went to Dachau. It's written, we need to read it, it needs to come out, and this anti-Semitism thing needs to be straightened out. And like I side with the sister. If I can't survive, I can't go to work, and I can't support my family. So therefore, any racial thing, you keeping me out of a job, you starving my family, okay? We can't have this. And white people, you're failing in mathematics. If you don't hire black people and brown people, you made a whole crap load of scabs to be hired against you when you go on strike because you deprived them forever. Let's think about that and get that on the table. That's one of the things that happened in the steel strike. Carnegie began to hire black people because the white people were out.
Okay, I wanted to respond to the emotional labor question. Oh, are you still taking questions from folks? Oh, he has a question for Bill. Oh, okay. On the emotional labor question, I think is such a good one. Here's one of the challenges and why earlier I was trying to distinguish between multiracial or interracial and intersectional. I think there are very different things going on with power. One of the frustrations that I hear from a lot of women of color in the labor movement is about things that are more related to diversity, equity, and inclusion moves than they are about fundamentally transforming the structures that are keeping these problematic hierarchies in place. So it's not easy work. You have to destroy things that are keeping black women and women of color from actually having the support to make transformation. One of the things we know is that institutions, especially in this country, are built not to change, right? So they're trying to fit in women of color into a space that wasn't designed for you, and then you don't have the support. One of the things that I learned from the movement, and this is from Linda Sarsour, who said to me, we don't need allies, we need accomplices. She tired. We're tired. Yeah, we need someone else to do work. But then we look historically and we say, well, when have people voluntarily given actual power away without a collective action to force that change? I don't think we can take the labor out of it. What we can do, and again, from critical race theory, there's this concept called interest convergence. And it's really about understanding those moments in US history where things move a little towards progress. It's always, critical race theorists would say, only incremental change and power shifting only occurs when it's in the interest of the dominant group. So in this case, the scholar is Derek Bell, and he critiques Brown versus Board of Education. We love Brown versus Board of Education, right? It got rid of segregation in the schools. But what did it really do practically for black mothers? It sent their children into hostile white schools from the safety of the black schools that they had into hostile white mobs. Was that change for the United States? Did it take away the burden on black mothers or black families for sending their kids into that? But all in the names of integration for the United States. So the way we understand the ways in which these hierarchies, these systems of oppression work, is that they rebuild themselves. They rebuild themselves in favor of dominant groups. And I removed race from saying that for a second. We know race is a thing. But also we could think of it in terms of ableism or any of the other things where we have a subordinated group and a privileged group, right? And so that means that part of building an intersectional movement where there's a distribution of pain is that we have to build systems and we have to do the education of dominant groups. They also have to do the education. And what we're seeing now sometimes in the movement is like, you know, there was a big critique about the 50-51 movement, and they're like, where's the black people? Okay, but black folks and immigrants, they're still organizing, but just not side by side with the white majority. And the question is, why aren't they in the other movements, right? So we have to engage in public education that is really centered in reframing who has the burden of bringing the United States to a closer version of what it is we think we're building as a collective movement. You know, I don't know that I think we know that we don't all share the same vision of what this country should be. And so those of us who are allies actually have to commit to the hard work. Multiracial movements and intersectionality is not just adding up people and hiring women and whatever. You actually have to commit to the structures, and that's the part that the collective movement can do. We gotta hold our unions, we gotta hold our academic institutions accountable for not just hiring or tenuring a black woman, but making sure that I can get on a panel like this and talk to my PhD students and they think that there's something valid in the critique of the status quo. I will leave and turn it over by saying, and this happens inside black community all the time when we're internally organizing. For people who have been oppressed in this country, sometimes we're afraid, right, of the devil we don't know. So we want to stick with the devil we know. This was the whole thing about whether or not black folks should be voting for Cuomo, right? Well, we know that white guy. We don't know what's going on with the other guy. And that fear is righteous and earned. Like, we have been under attack, we're tired, right? But I don't think that I know a way to take the labor out of it. I do know a way of shifting burden to dominant groups to do the work. Yeah.
I just want to address the question from the brother from LiUNA and the recent awardee from the Coalition from Black Trade Unions. So actually, I have an answer that connects LiUNA with CBTU, because this very same issue that you brought up, which is that within construction, both within the laborers and in the trades, there has been a kind of informal color bar that has persisted for many, many decades, and some might argue still exists today. And this issue actually came up after the rebellions of 1966 to 1968, when municipal governments were faced with the task of rebuilding those cities. And what did the trades do when it was time to rebuild Watts? What did the trades do when it was time to rebuild Detroit? They said that they will not hire any black workers as part of the rebuilding effort. And one of the reasons why the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists was organized was because they saw
what was going on in Watts and Detroit after the rebellions. They realized that the color bar that independent black labor organizations had been fighting against since the Civil War and in modern times since the 19 teens, it still had not been accomplished, even after the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And so the CBTU organized because they realized they needed another independent black labor organization, a mass organization to keep the AFL-CIO honest, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, is basically kind of like a Back to the Future kind of like comment about how, if you're dealing with this now, if you're trying to continue to integrate LIUNA now, well, you're in very good company, because generations of people have been trying to do that. And the most recent iteration of that is actually the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, who realized that this was a continuing problem.
I want to thank all of you for your patience and for all of your questions. We've had at least 20 here. So but I would like to at least end maybe by one fascinating and I think extraordinarily pertinent question. On the threshold of AI and exploitation, how is it that we can think about labor organization in this new era of, artificial intelligence, particularly about exploiting the intellectual labor of Black and brown folk?
Well, does anybody know the demographics of AI workers? They're primarily people of color, okay? So listen, I teach a course on this. Artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor intelligent, okay? There are a lot of workers who are teaching machines what they need to know so that when you open up Google and ask it a question, it has an answer for you. There are workers on the back end who are uploading all of this information in places like Venezuela, right, in Kenya, and yes, here in the United States, okay? These people are earning 50 cents to $2 per task and barely making ends meet, okay? And so the lessons from the last 100 years of Black labor activism apply to artificial intelligence. Because before we start thinking that we got machines and stuff replacing labor, what we need to know is that there's a lot of labor behind the machines.
Yeah, maybe one more question, and I think we can.
Thank you. Many people have left, but for you all, I'm very active in cooperative economics and have learned so much from Jessica Gordon-Nembard's book, a professor here at John Jay, Collective Courage, The History of African American Thought and Practice in Cooperative Economics. And so much of the story that she has pulled from the annals of history says, under duress, and I will say slavery is that, and everything that comes from even civil rights through Reconstruction, under all that duress, people also organize their own economic system. And I really would love to hear more about how the labor movement can support that, because the labor we do to take care of ourselves in community looks like solidarity, looks like real work, and it may actually be very anti-capitalist as we figure out what are we going to do into the future as stuff collapses. So I'm wondering if there's things about cooperative economics that you can bring from those annals to say that's also part of the labor movement. Thanks.
Yeah, I think unfortunately we probably need to call it here. We can have individual discussions after the panel, but again, I would like to thank all of you for this incredible discussion and all of your fascinating questions. Thank you so much.